Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Literacy View. We have Tim Rasinski with us tonight, our second time speaking with him, and it's a pleasure to have him with us. Let me just tell you a little bit about Dr. Rasinski. Timothy Rasinski is a professor of literacy education at Kent State University and director of its award-winning reading clinic. He has written over 200 articles and has authored, co-authored, or edited over 50 books or curriculum programs on reading education. And I happen to have, both Judy and I both have Tim's newest book, and it is called Artfully Teaching the Science of Reading, and it was co-authored by Chase Young, David Page, and yours truly, Tim Rasinski. So we are so happy to have you with us. Tonight, we're going to be talking, though, mostly about your guest blog that appeared on your website. And it was a friend of ours, too, who wrote the article, and it's by Nate Joseph, even though on the article it says Nathaniel Hansford. But for those of you who don't know who that is, it is Nate the Great, Nate Joseph, and he does a lot of work on meta-analyses, and his focus was on fluency. So it was so great to read this. And when I was reading this, I said to Judy, this would be a great one to go back to fluency and to bring it back to Tim. So, Tim, when I read the guest blog, what became very apparent was that repeated reading is the most effective way of working on fluency. Even though there are other ways to work on fluency, Nate showed his little bar graphs, and we saw that that was the most effective, repeated readings. I'd love to hear from you about his findings and his guest blog. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, absolutely. Let me give you an update though on my bio. I retired from the university on June 1st. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So I'm kind of freelancing it now. Actually, the reason I'm retiring is I tell people I have 7 grandchildren, and 5 of them under the age of 3, and the youngest are twins.
Oh,
So
wow.
we got our handful. I was telling Faith earlier that I was babysitting our 2-year-old granddaughter earlier this morning, so I'm pretty wiped out in the evening. But yeah, I've been following Nate's work for at least a couple of years, and it really does some interesting stuff. And he's wide ranging. He seems to be really quite academic in his approach. So what he has to say, you have to believe, especially, if you come from this science of reading perspective, and you guys see yourself there, I see myself there. And so, what really stunned me though was when he posted, and let me just mention my website. It's timrasinski.com. And if you click on blog, his is the most recent blog there. And he did an analysis of the effects of repeated readings. And I was stunned by what I saw. His research, or his meta-analysis, indicated that repeated readings in the elementary grades had an effect size of well over 0.1. I think it was 0.1, 0.6, if I'm not mistaken. And what we know is that anything above 0.8 is large. So, I'm thinking to myself, oh, I've been talking about repeated readings. I didn't even know it was that powerful.
I just want to be clear. It says in his report that the mean effect size for repeated reading was 0.76. That's what.
Okay.
Yeah, which is very large.
That's for everything.
Yes, yes, that's for everything.
So he's looking at high school, middle school, at every grade level. So yeah, and what if I'm not mistaken, that 0.8 that I mentioned is is the threshold for what's considered a very large effect. So,
Yes.
we're getting, we're pretty darn close with that. So, just actually, I contacted him when I first start seeing this, and he's actually arranging another little conference, and myself and a couple other folks to talk about reading fluency. So this is kind of a great introduction to that. So yeah, he just verified what I know and many other people know, you guys included, but actually brought it to the level of, hey, this is something we can't ignore. What got me into fluency 40 plus years ago was it was being ignored, not intentionally. It just was that we were all so interested in comprehension, developing vocabulary, phonics, and all those things that it just got pushed off to the side. We often associated with fluency with, oh, that's just reading orally. We want kids to read silently. It's making kids read fast, and those sorts of things. And while those are part of it, I think what happened was people took a look at that and said, well, I'm not sure that it's really all that important. And of course, the National Reading Panel came out in 2000, and they actually used some of my research from back that kind of shows you how old I am. But they indicated that, yeah, that's, since the National Reading Panel came out, that was one of the big five. And I think what Nate has been doing is just been adding to that evidence that this is something we need to pay attention to, because it's that bridge, as some people call it, to comprehension. We need to teach phonics. We need to get kids to comprehension, but fluency is that bridge that gets them there.
So Judy, do you see, just from your observations, is fluency something that is given enough attention?
So fluency is actually one of my favorite topics. So when I heard that we're having Timmy back on, or Dr. Tim back on, I was like ecstatic. I have to say, I think that I saw a little bit more of fluency a few years back. I saw more of it during my reading recovery days, actually.
Yeah.
But I think it's such a critical piece of the science. And that's my big goal in the school that I support, is to bring that in, but with decodable text. And it's such a critical piece because it's the application piece.
Yeah.
It's one thing to see all these things happening during your phonics period, or, to talk about sounds during your phonemic awareness block. But it's a whole different experience when you take it and show connected text. So I think that, I have to be honest, there was a lot of shared reading during my balanced literacy days. But then as I was on my journey into the science of reading, it started to look different, and we brought in decodable text, and we brought in connected text from foundations and had it projected and so forth. And I also have to say that back in my reading recovery days, we did stuff called familiar reads, which every lesson would begin with actually a familiar book. But those
wasn't familiar because, again, it was read again, which of course is repeated reading, but some of that was just memorizing words as well.
Well, I was going to get to that, Faith. So, in the early level books, it was a disaster, right? It was these patterned books, and there wasn't a lot of cognitive thinking. But in my books that were more sophisticated, and the text was, close to a child already being, breaking the reading code, but not fully there yet, it was good practice. But I don't use level text with my beginning readers anymore. I've shifted 100% towards decodables during instruction until children are closer to breaking the reading code. And I'm still working, even in the early stages, on phrasing and fluency. Like if a child's reading a sentence, I'm making sure that we go back and we do the sentence together with choral reading, echo reading. So I think it is a big part of the science, but I think the problem is that for a lot of teachers, they're focusing so much on getting their phonics to be strong, getting their phonemic awareness block to be strong, and
So-
fitting in all the pieces. I don't think that right now a lot of schools are giving enough attention to the application piece. So I hope that it really is prioritized, because I think it's the key for kids to break the code really well.
Can I add to that,
Yeah.
Judy? It's interesting that you should mention that, because the last time you guys had me on about a year or so ago, it was under different circumstances. I had signed that letter that
Oh,
me in
no,
trouble.
not the letter.
But the reason I did was because, all that work by Emily Hansford and such seemed to give priority to phonics over everything else. And I'm not denying that phonics is important, but like you just mentioned, when it begins to take up all the oxygen in the room, then you lose that opportunity to work on developing fluency with kids. So it's interesting that you noticed that, and we need to find a way of bringing that
It
back.
has to be prioritized. I feel
Okay,
very
but
strongly
here's
about that.
here's the issue. It has to be prioritized, but how? And that's always the case, right? Like we hear repeated reading.
Mhm.
And what I loved about Nate's article was he did address the how. And I'd like to bring this to everyone's attention.
Mhm.
Because there are a couple of things that I'd like to discuss in terms of how he does it. But one thing that caught my attention was at the very end when he said, let me find it. He said, fluency instruction might be most impactful when students are out of the emergent stage, can decode unfamiliar words, but not yet in the fluent reader stage, still lack automaticity with word and sound identification. I completely agree with that statement, that I think that when fluency is pushed way too early, and when I mean fluency, when they haven't been taught the code, and that's different from what Judy is talking about with decodable books as the practice opportunity. But when we're putting emergent readers into books where we're having them repeat it without really having a solid understanding of the code, then they start getting the message that they better just try to memorize these words because they don't really have a strong understanding at the beginning stages yet. And I know, Tim, that we talked a little bit about this over a year ago, and now I'm seeing that Nate brought this up, and I couldn't agree with him more. I think that what he's saying here is we could work on fluency, like Judy said, with more of the decodable piece with those brand new readers when they're just learning the code. But if they don't have enough code, they might be forced into sounding like readers when they're not really there yet. Your thoughts on that?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the word to keep in mind in Nate's comment, he said the word might. It's not proven yet.
Mhm.
And I think generally I agree with you. I think, there is a progression that goes from decoding to fluency, but it doesn't have to be. I'd like to share with you a study that we did. It was actually a dissertation study down at Ohio State. Oh, some people don't like Ohio State anymore. But with high risk first graders in a urban school, Columbus, Ohio. And what we developed, actually, it was called the fluency development lesson. I think I've written about it. Every article I ever write about, I write about it. But what we did was, with these first graders, we did repeated readings with nursery rhymes. They didn't know them. And again, basically, actually, we trained parents to do this, where the parents started by reading it, the short text. It takes only a minute or two to read a nursery rhyme. The parents read it, then they read it together, then they invited the child read it, and we acknowledge that it's probably at this point largely memorized. We asked the kids to point to the text as necessary, but then the key element was we did some word study. we looked at, you know, and the neat thing about nursery rhymes and poetry is I like to call them decodable and predictable because they have rhymes in them. And what's a rhyme, R-I-H-Y-M-E, is a rhyme, R-I-M-E, and that's, of course, part of phonics. So we would analyze that. You know, when you do a little Bo Peep is lost her sheep, look at all the eep words you can play around with simply by adding a beginning letter, beginning consonant, blend, or digraph. And that's what we did. So it was like a 10-minute of repeated readings or even less than that, and then 5 or 10 minutes of word study. What we found was that, and this was something parents were asked to do at home. So in other words, there's no difference in instruction in school. Highly trained teachers doing an assigned curriculum, except for, you know, what was done at home. And what we found was the parents who did this, the parents who were engaged in doing this, the children doubled their progress in reading fluency. Word decoding doubled over as little a 12-week time. So as much as I agree with you in principle, I also need to say we need to kind of, well, I like to call it artful. We need to be artful about this and think of ways that we can be creative in engaging kids. You know, one of the problems with repeated readings is it gets boring after a while. We need to find ways of getting kids to want to do it. And to me, the artful way has always been this notion of performance. If you're going to perform something, you know, you're going to rehearse it. And rehearsal is nothing more than a repeated reading. But it's not repeated reading to read fast.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's typically the approach. Let's read to, you know, hit one of those benchmarks. It's to read with expression. And that's the other part of fluency that often gets ignored. We talk about fluency being ignored. The part of fluency that gets ignored is prosody or expression.
Mm-hmm.
And when it focuses on speed, you know, you don't get a chance to read with expression. You begin to sound like a robot. So I love those kinds of texts like poetry. I think Nate mentioned readers' theater scripts because they're meant to be rehearsed. They're meant to be performed. They're meant to be read not only automatically and accurately, but also with expression.
Yeah. So Nate did put that in, that it can be boring doing the repeated reading. And he did mention in the article that readers' theater, partner reading, that these are all ways to mix it up so
Yeah.
that, you know, you're not doing the same thing.
Right. And,
Um,
you know, oh, I
yeah.
don't hate to interrupt, but it's not just repeated reading. There's a group in England, the UK. They call it Herts for sure. I can't say that right correctly. They always make fun of me when I do. Herts for sure for learning. And they have a fluency program with their younger readers. I forget what they call them, level 1 or 2. But basically, it's repeated reading, but it's also assisted reading, where the children would chorally read as a group. They would read with the teacher. So, and they're getting remarkable results in very short periods of time. And again, it's improvements in word recognition, fluency, and most importantly, they're showing improvements in comprehension using a standardized test.
Yeah, so I'm glad you mentioned that. In the article, Nate mentioned how he goes about doing this repeated reading.
Mhm.
And he starts off with reading aloud first, and then having the children join him and do a choral read. So I have a little bit of a different approach. I want to know how Judy approaches this because, you know, I just think a little bit differently from what I just saw. Judy, how do you go about doing fluency?
So, you know, it's interesting. As Tim was speaking, so many thoughts went through my mind. He mentioned my favorite buzzword, assessment. When you say assessment, what does that assessment look like? Does it mean like if you took those words and put them in isolation, would those kids be able to decode those words like sheep if they were not really generally reading at grade level and
Are you
so
asking
forth?
me?
Yeah, I'm just curious.
Yeah, because what we're doing in an example I gave, the kids are memorizing the text, but then when we begin to isolate the individual words, then we get into that orthographic mapping. Let's examine that word sheep. Do you notice the EEP? It says EEP. What other words do we know that have
So
EEP?
it's more of an informal assessment. It's not a
Oh,
formalized.
that's not an assessment at all. What we looked at was standardized measures of word recognition and fluency. So at the end of that program, we gave the kids, an oral reading fluency measures. Now, here's a passage, read it. We'll count the number of words you read correctly in a minute's time. The typical oral reading fluency that
Yeah, I
is
use
given.
that with the kids.
So your
Mhm.
approach, what you're saying is that would be analytic phonics. So for people listening, it's kind of taking the whole, like starting with rhymes and
Mhm.
then going to the word level and then breaking it down into onset and rhyme and then
Mhm.
switching up the onset to make new words, to do
Sure.
it analytically.
But okay, no, I'm saying don't do this to the exclusion of other approaches to word decoding. I think what we need to do is, come at it from every direction.
Yeah.
Uh,
So I just wanted to jump in. So like in my practice, I've actually shifted. I remember the books that I used before. They were very fun, they were engaging, but they didn't follow a scope and sequence. It wasn't as systematic. And what I was finding is that not enough kids were making the connection of what they're seeing in their phonics block and so forth was actually happening in text. And I
mhm.
think for kids, especially as they're learning how to read, it's really important to make those connections. So right now we're working with text that is more connected to their scope and sequence in class, but doing similar types of
So,
things. But the
mhm.
only thing that's interesting, Faith, and I'm interested in your view on this. So even if you're showing connected text that's at, matches the tier 1 instruction in the class, there's always a couple of kids in class that are not that are still struggling. Now they're still seeing a text projected on the screen that's based on grade level content.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that, Faith? Because there are going to be 3 or 4 or maybe
Yeah.
5 kids in the class that are still working on CVC words, or developmentally, that's where they're at in terms of their reading, but they're still seeing what the class is working on, which is maybe glued sounds that have like onk and
Yeah.
all and
Yes.
so forth.
So, right. So they're not there yet, is what you're
They're
saying.
not, but they're still seeing it, which is similar to
So here's
to,
so
different things.
here's how I look at it.
But-
Those kids
But
need
it's still
to
decodable.
they need to see grade level material. Those struggling kids need to hear grade level
Right.
material. They need to see it. They need to
Right.
be part of the class. Are they going to be able to keep up? The
Probably not,
idea
right?
is that in small group, we want to address those needs, but that would be as a supplement. It should not supplant grade level
So,
work. It
so
should
is what you're
supplement,
saying,
and
so
then
is
they
what
get
you're
what
saying
they.
you could, sorry about that. So is what you're saying, like, okay, so then you're taking them to do a small group, right? You're probably working with like a book that has CVC words. Would you recommend starting maybe also with looking at that poem or that passage too, or
No,
leave it alone?
no, I
Leave it
would
alone,
not
right?
do that in small group
Right.
because they need, if you're pulling them in small group, they need something that
So that's what I'm
addresses
doing
what
right
they.
now.
So just to go back to what
Yeah.
Nate said, Tim, he said he starts off with reading aloud to the kids and then they do that. Now, that's fine for a whole class, right? If you're doing, let's say, a whole class lesson on fluency, maybe that's a good way to start. But if you are working with those struggling readers, I want to hear what they can do individually and give them a chance to try to get through it. And then I will model what it should sound like. Then I bring them all in to do it with me, and then they read it to themselves. So this way they're getting multiple readings, practicing what they need. I wouldn't call on a struggling reader, individually in front of a whole class. But in a small group, I want to assess what they can do with what I'm working on in phonics with them. But it's a little bit different if I'm working whole class Then I'm doing a lesson on fluency. I will model and maybe have them join me and maybe break the room up into smaller groups to come in and chime in and practice, maybe do a partner read. But I would work this differently. Tim, could we get some advice from you in terms of from whole class to small group? How would you?
Yeah, because it's a lot to think about, right? It's not as
Well, that's the art of teaching.
right.
Is how does a teacher manage that? There's no uh, structured curriculum that says, okay, do this with big groups, but here's how you do it with small groups and so on. I don't know of any curriculum like that. That's where you're a teacher. You have to be an artist, and that's why I've said I'm going to kind of brag about this notion that to be a teacher, you have to be an artist and a scientist. You can't be one or the other, and that's why teaching is such a challenge. And it's during the whole language days, we are too far shifted to the art part, and now we're in the science part. Well, can we find that place that allows teachers to be creative and authentic and aesthetic? But one thing came to mind, a couple things, I guess I'll go off here. One of the things I love doing is something that teachers have done for years: start every day with a song or a poem that the teacher reads it, then okay, let's join in, let's read it, and okay, let's bring it up into parts. Girls do these few lines, the boys do these lines, and so on. So in a matter of 5 minutes or so, you can get 6 or 7 repeated readings. Because a song or a poem, it's not terribly long. You can get through it pretty quickly. And what I love about that is, you can post material. And this I do it on my website, on my Twitter feed. Material that's seasonal. I just posted some poetry about Hanukkah this morning, or tomorrow morning on Fluency Friday. I'm going to be posting some songs about Christmas, and so kids have a chance to learn a little bit about those holidays, and at the same time develop fluency. But something that you mentioned rang a bell in my head. You mentioned the importance of kids being exposed to grade level material, even though they may not be able to read fluently grade level material. And that's really important. Of course, we want kids to, our job is to accelerate kids' progress. The great Steve Stahl, and I'm sure you know a lot of his work, he passed away way too early. He did an early study in fluency in Georgia with second graders. And basically, it was a repeated reading study. And what he found was that, and they were just repeatedly reading, I think, stories out of short passages out of their basal reading program. But what he found was the kids across the board, they made progress. But the greatest progress was made when the children were given difficult material to read. About, you might say at their frustration level, or if they were struggling readers, at their grade level. And I remember kind of arguing with him about this. How is that? We never to say don't let kids read with frustration. We said what happens is when you do the repeated readings, just like you guys mentioned, you're supporting the kids. Number one, the teacher's reading it, and then two, let's join in. Why don't you practice with a partner now? Let's come back now and let's see if you can read it for the rest of the group. So you get 4 repeated readings in that way. And because of that support, kids can handle more difficult material. And if they do that, Steve's research indicates that we can begin to accelerate their progress. So, I really love that you mentioned that, Faith, and we should not deny kids that opportunity to read material. The challenge is, and again, here's the art: how do we provide that support that allows them to deal with that more difficult material? And of course, again, following up with examining the words within the text. Some of the more difficult words that can be generalized to other words, like, as you mentioned, rhymes and such. So it's really, there's so much we still need to learn about reading fluency, but I think, hopefully we're on the right track to make it an integral part of the curriculum.
There's no evidence for a plan in terms of like, you should do this. There's no recipe
right
out there for the proper order of things.
Right.
You're saying.
Well, sorry for interrupting.
No,
but,
I'm interested.
I think that's what Mark Seidenberg has been talking about. I know a lot of people have been talking about that the talk he gave at Yale a while back. But I think what he wanted to say is something he mentioned before. He says, the science of reading is pretty well settled, or, at least the broad stroke. What is not settled is the science of teaching reading. And that's what you're talking about, I think, is, how do we actually do it? How do we, implement the science in ways that are not only effective, but I want children to be, engaged and joyful in the instruction that they get.
Yeah, and that's funny that you say that. The joy piece. I think that right now, a lot of teachers in the field are learning programs and curriculums. And when you're learning something, sometimes it's not that easy for it to be joyful. And I've seen what some curriculums are calling shared reading, but it looks completely different than what I knew shared reading as before. It's more of like the teacher's doing the heavy lifting, and then there's some word analysis very early on for kids, but I don't see that real shared experience as much as I'm hoping for, which is why I'm desperate to make sure that, it's not just the shared reading that's now in some programs that are evidence-based that looks completely different than the shared reading experience that so many of us knew and loved and want to work with more, but using maybe different text, like decodable connected text.
Yeah, that's what I love about you guys. I mean, you anchor yourself in the science, but you say, we still have a ways to go to how to actually implement that in the trenches. It's one thing for me out here in academia saying this is what you need to do, but
right.
It's another thing to be there in the classroom every day with 20, 25 kids, and you're trying to implement this stuff.
I think that fluency is crucial, but it can be interpreted, as you said, as fast reading. And we know that when something is being measured, like ORF, that people want to increase the ORF.
Right.
And then what happens is then we're ignoring the expression and how they're reading. And,
right.
And then they're missing
and there's not enough faith from what I'm seeing in a lot of these quote unquote evidence and research based programs. There's not enough attention on punctuation and looking at how your voice changes. There's more of this attention on vocabulary, which is great. But like I said, it's like forcing kids that haven't even broken the code to now do close reading.
Right.
We should be doing more of that, reading part. Learning how to read. I want to see more of learning how to read for the kids that need to learn how to read. If kids don't have that application and practice, we're not going to get as far as we could. So I think it is a pivotal time in education, and some people might not like what I have to say, but I say we need more application. And I think that a lot of schools right now are struggling with figuring out how to structure their literacy block. And if we don't prioritize what's important, it's problematic. But I think, just because the program says it's shared reading doesn't mean that it's actually practice time where the kids are actually reading the words.
Right.
Nate's article, I just want to mention, Nate pretty much is aligned to what you're saying, Judy. It says, in my opinion, fluency instruction is most important when students can decode some words, but cannot yet read fluently independently. Once students can read a variety of complex texts without any support, I think fluency instruction becomes less important. So now he's not saying it's not important, but we're looking at it as far as what do kids need and when. And I don't think that's out there a lot. That's why this article really got my attention, because he is talking about how much, when do you do it? Like a little bit above that, he was talking about when kids are in the early emergence stage of reading, ages 3 to 6, meaning they are still learning the basics of decoding. That's a lot different. He said he thinks it makes sense to use limited repeated reading with decodable text, like using the decodable text to practice in a limited way. He said, however, as kids enter the decoding stage of reading, let's say ages 7 to 10, and these are just averages, I think it makes sense to both increase the amount of fluency instruction and the number of types of fluency instruction. Tim, would you agree with that in terms of what he's saying, looking at the age of the kids,
Yeah.
looking at what you do, and increasing it as they get older,
Sure.
once they have more word knowledge under their belt?
If we look at this as a continuum,
Right.
yeah, early on, it's phonemic awareness, phonics, maybe a little bit of fluency.
Right.
And as we go through it, of course, the phonemic awareness drops away, and now they're more on phonics and a little bit more on fluency. And further on down the line, the phonics begins to drop back, and now it's fluency and vocabulary, perhaps. Yeah,
Right.
I think that makes good sense, of course.
Yeah.
You mentioned something also. You reach a point where fluency itself is I hate to say, being a fluency guy, it's not all that important.
Oh my
You reach a
God.
threshold.
Wow.
We did a study. It was really interesting with college students. First of all, we did one of those oral fluency with college freshmen, and we did an oral fluency assessment. Read one, as it was a 12th grade passage, read it for 1 minute. And we also had we got their college ACT scores. We could predict their ACT score from 1 minute of reading. And that to me tells me that fluency really is important. If you don't have it,
Wow. You could wait, with what percentage of accuracy?
we looked well. Pretty much all these kids could read with 98, 99, 100% accuracy. That wasn't an issue for these guys. But the other thing was we did another. So number one, fluency is really critically important. But number two, a few years later, we did a study where we said, okay, what is the maximum fluency we should have? So what we did was we got college graduates. We asked them to read again a 12th, 13th grade passage, and what we found was that the average, the mean reading rate was about 145 words per minute, and that was a lot lower than what I thought would be on that. So what it tells me is that once we get kids reading around 145, 150 words correct per minute, that's good. I mean, we can begin. Let's begin to shift out of that and get into just authentic reading, knowledge building, that sort of thing. But I was kind of stunned because, as you mentioned, I think Faith, you mentioned, Judy, you also, that we get into this idea of looking at those oral reading scores. All we want to do is get them higher and higher and higher, and that's not necessarily the case. Some kids may feel good because they learn to read fast, but those are the same kids who, when they read, they're just blowing through the text as fast as they can. I still remember a couple children, 2 girls we had, second graders in our reading clinic a few years ago. And, we start off, we ask them to read something so we can watch what they do. Both of these children looked up at the teacher, college grad student, and said, am I supposed to read this as fast as I can? Where did that come from? It was all this emphasis on, let's read faster than the day before. And that, to me, I call it fake fluency. We want fast reading, but we want fast reading the way you and I became fast readers, which is how we just read a lot, right? It's really, fluency boils down to practice. But it's the kind of practice, the artful practice, again, that we need to aim for our kids. So.
Yeah, that one of the ways of practicing here is, I don't think it's a common practice. It's the varied reading. And Nate mentioned that in his article, where you take something that's very similar, about 80% of it is similar, but it's changed up a bit, just to vary it a bit, even though you are practicing a lot of the same material.
Yeah.
And I thought that was pretty interesting. He said there was a high, degree of, how did he say it? It was close to the repeated reading in terms of being effective.
Yeah.
So do you use that, Tim?
Yeah. I love that stuff. We do it with poetry and song, and what we use is parodies. You guys know the work of Alan Katz, Katz? He wrote the book. His work was "Take Me Out of the Bathtub." It's a collection of silly songs that he wrote. So he took "Take Me Out to the Ball Game," "Take Me Out." He turned it into "Take Me Out of the Bathtub," "Take Me Out of the tub. I've been here sitting since 2:30. I've been so, I washed all over my body, my head, my toes in between. I use 1, 2, 3 bars of soap. Take me out, I'm clean.
That's
It's,
funny.
so what I love
That
about
is
that,
funny.
it's
That brings back flashbacks of my childhood singing.
yeah,
Miss Lucy
right.
had a steamboat. The steamboat had a bell. Miss Lucy went to heaven, and the steamboat, and then we did different versions of that.
Yeah. You ought to get Alan up here to interview because he's a hoot. Just such a funny guy, but so brilliant on that. But what I loved about it is there's words carry over from one text to the other, but also the melody. And the melody kind of acts as a bridge too.
Yes,
Everybody knows "Take Me Out to the Ball." Yeah.
right.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
I
So
thought an interesting point that Nate made in the article is that you don't even have to think of how to restructure the piece. Chat GPT or AI can actually do it. So I
yeah.
definitely will have to message Nate and find out how
Yeah.
exactly to do
It's
that.
scary. I just the other day I went into Chat GPT and I said, write me a 8-line poem for children that rhyme that has the AT rhyme in it. And it was amazing what it came out with.
That's awesome.
But it's also scary, you
Yeah,
know?
it's pretty unbelievable. Well, we have your book here,
Yeah,
and so
I do too.
yeah, there we go. So
Okay.
now you keep mentioning this word, artfully teaching,
Mhm.
the science of reading, and in the parts that I read, that I wanted to go back to, you mentioned in the phonics section on page 51, you mentioned how there's a lot of research for the synthetic approach, that is going from the small sounds to build a word to synthesize sounds, that has probably more research. And you said the synthetic approach is found to be superior to one that is analytic. However, these results do not mean that there is no place for analytic phonics. Brady 2020 points out that the adoption of a synthetic or analytic approach is not so much an either or decision, but more a question of when and why one should be chosen over the other. I would agree with that. And I would say that that's something that, we're missing, because sometimes it is important to take a look at a word like sheep and point out to kids, well, if you change one sound, now you get deep or sleep, you change. So there's nothing wrong with that. So we should be using analytic phonics when, appropriate, even
Yeah.
though synthetic phonics, of course, is found to be maybe more effective and a first line of
Right.
teaching. So could you talk a little bit about that, artfully teaching
Okay.
any of these components? And I don't
Yeah.
mean,
Well,
like,
yeah.
what do you mean by that, artfully teaching?
Well, we talked about 3 characteristics of artful teaching. Um, Number one, that it's authentic. John Dewey wrote years ago about, what we do in a classroom should reflect what happens outside the classroom. So, and we can all see examples of sometimes what we ask children to do is kind of divorced from anything that is in the real world. So we, think about authentic, and then the idea of aesthetic. Louise Rosenblatt talks about efferent and aesthetic reading. Efferent reading is reading to educate the head, which is clearly important, but we also read to touch the heart. We read to be inspired, to have our breath taken away. And, I don't think we're giving kids those opportunities to have those aesthetic responses. When you read "Love You Forever," and that little lullaby where the mom sings "I'll love you forever." I have teachers tell me I can't get through it. I'm getting
Yes.
tears.
Yeah.
Kids need to have those kinds of experiences. And then the other one is no, let me see, creative. The idea being, and it's kind of like what we've been talking about this conversation. we need to give teachers the agency to be creative within the parameters of science, so that it's not just reading a script or being on a certain page on a certain date. The reason why most teachers, I would argue all teachers became teachers, is because they're creative individuals.
Yep.
And we need to allow teachers to do that. So those are kind of the three principles we're looking at. But let me give you a quick example. Well, it actually all started with the fluency stuff, notion, the idea of repeated readings. And I'm thinking, okay, I'm seeing the, the stopwatches and all that. And I start thinking about, well, where is it that we engage in repeated readings in real life? And that's where I got this notion of performance, whether it's being in a poetry slam or singing in a choir or, in a play, you rehearsed.
Right.
And if you didn't, probably wish you had there. So that's what got me into things like readers theater and that. And then the other thing I'll bring up, since you mentioned the phonics part, is this notion, and Nell Duke wrote about this in ASCD journal. She wrote about Wordle, and she actually gave me a shout out on it. But the idea that, think of all the games that we play as adults. We're getting that time of year. It's getting cold in the winter. Nights are long. We get together with family and friends, and what do? We get out a game and play for an hour or so. How many of those games are word games? Scrabble, Boggle, Balderdash, Wheel of Fortune, Password, Buzzword, you name it. Well, if you and I like to play word games, why wouldn't kids? And that's that came to me. And the other thing is, are you guys Wordle players? You like to play Wordle?
My husband and
I
my
don't play
children are
Wordle.
Wordle players.
Yeah.
They share their scores and
Yeah, I know. Well, here's the point. If you do it regularly, you get better at it, right? And we have a special name for that, getting better at something. It's called learning, right? You begin to learn how words work, in that environment. Well, that's where these word ladders came up. So I wanted to
love
make
your
sure I
word
gave you a
ladders.
chance, Judy, to talk about it. But
Yeah.
it all started with a science art piece by Bruce McCandless and Chuck Perfetti and Isabel Beck. They called it word building, but basically it was asking kids to go from one word to the next. These were struggling readers, adding or subtracting, changing a letter.
word chains. That's another.
Yeah, word change is another name for that. Yeah, right. And I looked at it. They got great results. They found, when they compared kids doing this with kids in alternative intervention, and these are first graders, showed greater improvement in phonemic awareness, word decoding, and comprehension. But I thought to myself, okay, that's pretty cool. How about if we do this? And the word ladder is basically a word chain. But what I tried to do is I made it go from the first word and the last words go together. So it kind of turns it into a game. And it's really been, it's based on research, and it's a game. And it what's better than that? You're giving kids something that they find engaging, and they're learning at the same time.
Right.
What Nell Duke wrote about in her ASCD blog is, she mentioned that in these word ladders that I create, you just don't go from one word to the next. I give you the clue. So it's more like a crossword puzzle. Change one letter in this word to make a word that describes
Which
blah, blah, blah.
basically means it's talking about vocabulary
Vocabulary, right,
and
exactly.
comprehension too.
Yeah,
Right.
sure. If you know what the words mean, you can code them. You're more likely to understand, what it is you're reading.
Yeah.
So, that was, and again, to me, this is something I create. Well, it's no big deal. But we want to give teachers that opportunity to do that too. And what I love about this thing, I wish I could get you out some of my PowerPoint slides, is, and Judy, you probably see this, when kids do these word ladders, they start making their own. And teacher says, can you go from first to last or something like that? And I mean, when they're doing that, then you got them hooked. So
And I just hope that teachers are allowed to have time to do those great things.
Yeah.
It's always about time. I see teachers are very frustrated in the field. How do I get it all in?
Right.
We used to have more morning meetings. Some teachers are actually going back to morning meetings and actually talking about doing things like you're talking about right now. Like, there's one teacher who said her kids are having trouble with connecting that Hegarty to that phonics piece, and then she's going to play around with like the word ladder component tomorrow morning. And I said, do it Do it for a
Yeah.
week. Let's see, if it helps the kids.
And we're talking about 5 minutes or so, 5-10 minutes
Right.
max. You know?
But that's a lot now,
You know,
unfortunately.
yeah, you're right. Time is so precious.
And one other thing that I think that all of the fluency piece is so important for, it really does help with the reading, but it also helps to develop that oral language. And, for a long time, people weren't looking enough at those language standards. That's part of the standards too. And
Yeah.
being able to talk and being, that starts even from birth, right? Right after a baby's born, we're starting to develop that oral language and how to say a sentence. And that's so important for our kids to be able to have those rich language experiences as well. So it's definitely not a piece to be
Mhm.
neglected at
Yeah.
all.
That's one of the nice things about being a grandparent. You don't have to worry so much about keeping them alive. So you can you watch them grow from that one word sentence to two
Are they
words.
doing word letters yet, your
Are they
grandkids?
doing work?
The older ones are the
Okay, the
10 and
two-year-old
11
probably
year old.
will be soon, right?
Well, what's even more fun is what we did today. Sitting next to Addie, her name's Adelaide, and we read a couple books together. She has a blanket. She calls it a reading blanket. So we get cozy. And then what's better than that, And that, again, that's art of reading, the art of teaching reading, is to develop that love of reading, the aesthetic part of it.
Can I ask you one thing? I've been seeing a lot about echo reading and choral reading, right?
Mhm.
How do teachers figure out which to use, when to shift from echo to choral, or is it a back and forth
Yeah.
decision-making process?
I just, I like to think of it as, uh, they all seem to have the same, component to it. So, just, when you do choral reading the same way every day, again, it as Nate would say, it gets a bit boring. So let's break it up. Let's do a little echo reading, or let's have antiphonal
Very
reading.
often I do echo before the choral because
Mhm.
it seems like the echo is more
Yeah,
supportive than the choral.
right. And you're able to use your voice as the model
Yeah.
for the children. But sometimes, we do this antiphonal reading where boys, you do the first two lines, and the girls, you do the next two lines, break it up into parts.
Mhm.
One of my favorites is called cumulative choral reading. I don't know if you ever heard of that.
Mhm.
Um, I've done this around Constitution Day in September, where we want kids to learn the preamble. We, the people of the United States. And the way we do it is I break it up into 8 lines, and we'll start with 1 or 2 students reading the first line. We, the people of the United States. You come to the second line, 2 more students join in. And then the third line, 2 more students. So you just keep getting bigger, bigger, bigger. By the time you get to that last line, do ordain and establish this Constitution, you got everybody reading.
Mhm.
And it's inspiring to hear that. You start with one voice and you're trying to say, listen, we're a country, we're together. And by the time you get that last one. So again, that's an example of the artfulness. And I got that just by watching some teachers do that. And I said, boy, that's pretty clever.
Mhm.
Most of the things I share, actually, I steal from teachers. Yeah, they're
Well,
the art people, artful people.
I'm glad you said that because I think that teachers are trying to figure this all out. And sometimes when you walk into a room, you will notice that they are, through trial and error, they are doing some great things. And I think what you said here in the book, and I want to, we'll wrap up, but right in the introduction, you said, essentially, we need the teacher back in teaching. The science of teaching reading is simply the input into a creative teaching machine. The output is what students need. A few examples follow of creative, authentic, and aesthetic outputs. We have seen these in action and believe that they are good examples of teachers integrating the science and art of reading instruction. And I think that,
Did I write that? I'm impressed by my own writing.
Faith, I think it's time you give Tim a cheer. We have
okay.
not given him one cheer tonight.
Oh no.
No, a cheer is good.
Oh, okay.
It's
Yes.
new. We just bought cheers. We don't only do the BS. Now we have happy news.
Yeah,
So
thank you.
I think I just want to leave everybody with the message that fluency is important. Repeated reading is most effective. All these other things we're talking about are ways to kind of jazz it up a bit and make it interesting, but we still need to do this. It's important for kids to be reading aloud. And my last question to you is, what about silent reading in terms of fluency, reading independently? Yes, no, yes, you believe. Is it
Well, yeah.
after they've had multiple practices the other way? Because that's how I would do it. I would leave the independent after we've already, I know what they can decode.
Mhm.
I modeled, we practiced, and then now you practice on your own. I wouldn't do
Sure.
that at first go.
Right. And it can be done silently or orally, for sure. But also the other side of that is, uh, you know, we call that, sometimes I call repeated reading deep reading. But we also need to pair that with wide reading. That's, when you read something reasonably easy, and then you like we read, we read an article in the newspaper, we move on to the next one, That's important too. And we need to give kids that opportunity. Now, here's the challenge though, is when, you have that sustained silent reading time, how do you know the kids are actually reading? And, my friend Lorraine Griffith would often says, she would call that fake reading.
Yes.
They're just uh, displaying, pretending that they're reading.
Right.
And again, that's the challenge with that. But
Right.
again, that's what the artist and the teacher do. They figure out a way to make that work.
But I think if you're kind of letting them read silently after they've worked with you,
Sure.
and you give them a comprehension question, now read to yourself to find out this, then they have to be accountable, right?
Absolutely.
I think that's
Absolutely.
the point, to bring in some comprehension, right?
Right. Hey, can I mention one thing before you sign off?
Yeah.
You were you kindly mentioned the importance of prosody or expression, and I follow you guys. When you interviewed Nell Duke, she mentioned the oral fluency rubric that I developed, and she was kind enough to mention me. It's on my website for free if anybody wants it. So it's at timrasinski.com. You click under resources and you scroll down, you'll find it there. So I just wanted to mention that. That's when you talk about assessment, that's part of it too.
Great. Judy, any last thoughts before we wrap up?
No, just, everybody, don't forget, fluency is part of the 5 pillars plus writing. Give it the love and attention it deserves. Keep working on the decoding skills, because we know that was neglected for a very long time. The better kids decode, the easier it will for them to work on their phrasing and fluency and kick ass and
Cross that bridge to comprehension.
Yes, exactly. And to be literate for life. So basically, everybody, thanks Timothy for being here with us today. We are so happy to have you back. And follow us on Facebook, The Literacy View, Real Teachers Letting Loose. Follow us on Instagram, The Literacy View. Follow Faith on Instagram at High Five Literacy. Follow me at Boxner Damsky. Also, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Our numbers are growing. People are sharing and caring. Also, follow us on our Apple Podcasts, Spotify. We're everywhere. And if you like what we're doing, please write us a review. Tell your friends about us. The biggest compliment you could give us is sharing with your friends and letting other educators, teachers, parents, researchers, administrators know what we're doing. We're trying to make a difference in the life of children.
Yep.
And you are.
Again,
thank you.
This is Dr. Tim Rasinski's newest book, Artfully Teaching the Science of Reading. So thank you. It was a delight speaking with you. I know it's been a long day. We appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you guys. Thanks for all you do.
Thank you. We appreciate you.
Happy holidays.
Thank
Same
you.
to you.